July 26, 1989. A 16-year-old girl comes home from a long shift at an amusement park, walks upstairs to her bedroom, changes out of her work clothes, and sets her alarm clock for the next morning. She is responsible. She is tired. She does not want to be late for work. She sets the alarm the way she always does, lies down, and closes her eyes. She will never open them again. And the person who made sure of that will spend the next 31 years living freely, not in another city, not in another state, but in the same community, breathing the same Kansas City air, close enough to look the family in the eye. Welcome to Cold Case Vault. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. This community stretches across every continent, and we want to hear from you. Now let's get into this story. Kansas City, Missouri in the summer of 1989 was a city that believed in its own familiarity. The humid Midwestern heat rolled in thick every July, settling over the working-class neighborhoods on the northeast side where families had lived for generations. Near East 9th Street and Van Brunt Boulevard, people knew each other's names, recognized whose car was parked where, and waved from front porches without thinking twice about it. Parents let their children play outside on those streets without a second thought. It was the kind of neighborhood that made you feel like the world couldn't reach you. Fawn Marie Cox was 16 years old and she had already figured something out that a lot of teenagers never do. She understood the value of showing up. She had a part-time job at Worlds of Fun, Kansas City's big amusement park, and she took it seriously. She earned her own money. She held her own hours. She was the kind of young woman who made the people around her proud just by being who she was. On July 26, 1989, Fawn worked a full-day shift at Worlds of Fun and stayed on into the evening. Her shift ended at 11 o'clock that night. She went straight home. No stops. No detours. She had another shift the next morning and she was not the type to be late. When she walked through the door, the house was already quiet. Her mother and her siblings were asleep downstairs. The air conditioner was running the way it always did on those suffocating Kansas City summer nights, a constant mechanical hum that filled every room, softened every edge, made the house feel sealed off from the rest of the world. Fawn went upstairs to her bedroom on the second floor. She changed out of her work clothes. And then she did that one final thing, that one small, heartbreaking act of routine, that would become the most painful detail in this entire story. She set her alarm clock for the morning. Because she had a shift. Because she didn't want to be late. Because that is what a responsible 16-year-old does at the end of a long day. That was the last thing Fawn Marie Cox ever did. On the morning of July 27, 1989, the alarm went off. It kept ringing. No footsteps crossed the floor above. No alarm was silenced. No sound came from the second floor except that alarm, ringing and ringing and ringing into a silence that no one downstairs could yet explain. Fawn's mother and her sister Felicia went upstairs to wake her. Felicia Cox later described what happened in words that have never stopped hurting the people who have heard them. She said, "I went to shake her. Wake up. Wake up." But Fawn had been gone for a long time. Fawn Marie Cox was found lying on her bed. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death while her family slept directly below her, hearing nothing, nothing at all, over the steady sound of the air conditioner. The Kansas City Police Department was called. Investigators arrived and began reading the crime scene, and what they found immediately changed the shape of everything. The killer had not come through a door. He had not come through a first-floor window. He had climbed up to the second floor of that house in the middle of the night and broken through the specific window of Fawn's specific bedroom. Let that settle in for a moment. Climbing to a second-floor window in total darkness, without making a single sound loud enough to wake the family sleeping directly below, is not what a person does when they are stumbling across a house they have never seen before. You do not guess which window on the second floor leads to a teenager's bedroom. You do not climb to it in the dark on the first try. You do not get in and out without a sound unless you already know exactly where you are going, exactly what you are going to find, and exactly how long the air conditioner will run to cover everything above. The air conditioner had done the killer a favor he had almost certainly counted on. The crime scene investigators collected and preserved biological evidence from Fawn's body. And from that first morning, the investigation carried one central question, not who in this neighborhood could have done this, but who among the people who already knew Fawn, already knew the house, already knew which window to climb through in the dark. The initial investigation focused on 3 teenagers from the northeast Kansas City neighborhood. Witnesses connected them to the crime. Circumstantial evidence provided enough to bring charges, and all 3 were charged in Fawn Cox's murder. Because they were juveniles at the time of their arrests in 1989, Missouri law sealed their court records. Their names were not published. Their identities were protected. During interrogations, the 3 teenagers pointed toward the 9th Street Dog Gang, one of the troublemaking groups in the neighborhood at the time, as the responsible party. One of the 3 teenagers was held in custody for 8 months. 8 months in a cell. While the person who had actually climbed through that second-floor window was walking around free, just streets away, unsuspected and completely uninvestigated. The DNA technology available in 1989 could only perform blood type comparison and basic analysis. The results came back inconclusive. Not enough to convict. Not enough to fully exonerate either. The system did not know what to do with a result that pointed nowhere, so it did what systems often do in those moments. It waited. Then the entire foundation gave way. The primary witness, the person whose statement had held the whole case against the 3 teenagers together, recanted. Admitted to lying. Took back every word. With no witness, no conclusive DNA, and no physical evidence connecting the 3 teenagers to Fawn's death, all charges were dropped. They were released. 3 innocent people. One of whom had spent 8 months of his life locked up for something he did not do. And somewhere in northeast Kansas City, the real killer exhaled. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this story and who understands just how deeply this case goes. The case went cold. Fawn's friends from Northeast High School kept asking each other questions that had no answers. Her family kept living inside a wound that would not close. And deep inside the KCPD evidence storage, the biological samples collected from Fawn Cox's body in the summer of 1989 continued to sit in the dark, waiting for a technology that did not yet exist to be invented. In the early years of the 21st century, the KCPD crime lab went back to those samples. The DNA technology had advanced to a point where investigators could now do something that was completely impossible in 1989. Extract a full DNA profile of the suspect from biological evidence that had been stored for over a decade. That profile was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's National Criminal DNA Database, which holds the genetic profiles of everyone in the American justice system who had ever been arrested and tested. There was no match. Not because the killer did not exist, but because he had never left a trace inside the criminal justice system. CODIS can only find people who are already in it. And whoever had climbed through Fawn Cox's window that night had somehow moved through 30-plus years of life without triggering a single entry in the national database. Through all of it, through every dead end, every failed match, every year that passed without an answer, the Kansas City Police Department never closed this case. Captain Ben Caldwell described it with a simplicity that carries tremendous weight. He said this case touched a lot of people because it was an innocent child killed in her own bed. He said it haunted the detectives and officers who worked it for decades. Generation after generation of KCPD investigators met with the Cox family. They kept the evidence. They kept pursuing the investigation. They kept the case alive when it would have been so easy to let it quietly disappear. When the Golden State Killer was identified in 2018 through advanced genetic genealogy, the world of criminal investigation changed overnight. Caldwell knew immediately that this was the tool that could do for the Fawn Cox case what Cody's never could. Instead of searching for the suspect inside the criminal database, a database the killer had apparently never touched, genetic genealogy searches for distant relatives of the suspect in public genealogy databases. The same databases where millions of Americans have voluntarily uploaded their DNA to trace their family history and find relatives they never knew they had. But genetic genealogy was expensive. It required specialized expertise. It was not something a police department could implement on its own with a standard operating budget. Caldwell knew the technology could break this case. He also knew KCPD needed a partner to make it happen. In 2020, 31 years after Fawn Cox set her alarm clock for the last time, the Kansas City Police Department partnered with the FBI Kansas City Field Office to apply advanced genetic genealogy to the biological evidence that had been sitting in storage since 1989. The answer came back in a matter of weeks. Not years. Not months. Weeks. For a family that had been waiting 31 years, that speed was almost impossible to process before the result hit. The Fawn Cox case became the first murder solved by the Kansas City Police Department using advanced genetic genealogy. A historic milestone. And a result that confirmed what Captain Caldwell had believed from the very first day he stood in that crime scene on East 9th Street. The killer was not a stranger. He was not a gang member. He was not someone from outside their world. The DNA led directly to a member of the family. Donald Cox Jr., Fawn Cox's own cousin, was 21 years old in the summer of 1989 when Fawn was 16. Donald Cox Jr. was family. Someone who could show up at the Cox home on East 9th Street without anyone questioning why he was there. Someone who knew the layout of that house. Someone who knew which room on the second floor was Fawn's. Someone who knew which window could be reached from outside in total darkness and total silence. Someone who had every reason to know that the air conditioner would be running on that July night and would mask every sound coming from above. Between November 9th and 11th of 2020, the Kansas City Police Department notified the Cox family. 31 years. And the answer was a name they already knew. Donald Cox Jr. was no longer alive when the DNA identified him. He had died of a drug overdose years before the genetic genealogy results came back in 2020. There would be no trial. No courtroom. No moment where Donald Cox Jr. would have to stand before a judge and hear out loud, in public, what he had done to his 16-year-old cousin on that Kansas City summer night. He escaped that moment entirely. The Kansas City Police Department did not officially release his name, following the American legal principle that a person who was never charged should not have their identity publicly disclosed. The name Donald Cox Jr. became public because the Cox family chose to speak it themselves when they talked to the press. It was their name. Their loss. Their right to define it on their own terms. Felicia Cox, the same sister who had stood at the edge of Fawn's bed on the morning of July 27th, shaking her shoulders, saying wake up, described the weight of what they received in 2020 in a single sentence. She said, "The answer isn't always what we were asking for." For 31 years, the family had built an image of the killer in their minds. A stranger. A gang member. Someone from outside. Someone whose name they would hear for the first time and feel nothing for except rage. The answer was a relative. Someone who had sat at the same tables. Someone who had been called family. Someone whose absence from those tables after 2020 would carry a completely different meaning than it did before. There are no answers about why. Donald Cox Jr. is gone. Whatever drove him to climb through his 16-year-old cousin's bedroom window on that night in the summer of 1989 will never be fully known. That answer died with him. The Cox family did not just lose Fawn in 1989. In 2020, they lost Donald too, and with him, every version of trust and memory they had ever attached to his name. This case leaves three things behind that matter directly to every family still waiting for answers. The first is about a decision made in 1989. The crime scene investigators who collected Fawn's biological evidence and placed it in storage had no way of knowing that 2020 technology would need it. They preserved it correctly because that was the right thing to do. That single decision, made in the middle of a summer investigation by people who had never heard the words genetic genealogy, was the entire foundation of what happened 31 years later. If you have a loved one who is a cold case victim, ask the investigating agency directly. Ask whether the biological evidence is still preserved. Ask whether it has been retested with modern technology. That question is your right to ask. The second is about a systemic gap that Caldwell openly acknowledged. He knew this technology could break the case. But the cost and the complexity kept it out of reach for years. That gap exists across the country. The technology to solve tens of thousands of unsolved cases exists right now. Not every police department has the budget to access it. If your loved one's case sits with a department that lacks resources, look into the nonprofit organizations that connect grieving families with genetic genealogy expertise at no cost to the department. That pathway exists and it has produced answers. The third is about what the crime scene was communicating from the very first morning. The detail about the second-floor window was never just a technical note about how the killer got in. It was the most important information about who the killer was. Someone who knew the house. Someone who had reason to know it. Traditional investigation pointed outward, toward the neighborhood, toward the gang, toward strangers. But the answer was never out there. It was already inside the family. Genetic genealogy was the only tool that could reach it. You stayed until the end of this story, and that matters more than you know. Fawn Cox deserved to turn off that alarm clock. She deserved to go to work that morning, come home that evening, and grow up. The least we can do is make sure her name is never forgotten, and you just did that by watching this far. If this story moved you, leave a comment right now telling us where you're watching from. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are not yet subscribed to Cold Case Vault, hit that button right now because the next case is already waiting and you do not want to miss it. Every story we tell is a promise to the families still waiting that the world has not moved on. Until next time, stay with us.